Good evening, and welcome to the Elevate Ethics of 2019. My name is Lorenzo Patelli, and I'm the Interim Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics. I would like to welcome the champions of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics, my fellow steering committee members, the esteemed faculty of the University of Denver, the student hosts, and all of you to tonight's panel discussion titled Elevate the Ethics of Artificial Intelligence. The Institute's mission is to disseminate a culture of ethical leadership through collaboration among students, researchers, and professionals. This evening, we want to engage in a conversation about the ethical issues of AI. Your presence here tonight and the many messages I received from people who could not be here with us, commending the Institute and the university for tackling such an important problem, demonstrates the relevance of having this discussion, which the Institute would like to continue with several other initiatives in the coming year. The song that you have been playing in the background, is the first ever pop song entirely composed through artificial intelligence by Sony Research Lab. Tonight, we will have the chance to hear more about other applications of AI from entrepreneurs who develop AI business solutions, researchers who have exploited AI to advance knowledge, and executives who have helped their organization to strategize about AI investments. The purpose of tonight's discussion is not to delegate to the panelists our own very answers to these questions. Rather, it is to take some time to reflect and think critically about one of the biggest revolutions happening in our lifetime, which is the evolution and implementation of AI. So thank you for being here and contributing to tonight's discussion with your questions, expertise, and interests. Tonight's event would not be possible without our generous sponsors, the Daniel Ethics Initiative and Pinnacle Assurance. Thank you for your loyal support to the Institute and for being champions of enterprise ethics. Now I'll introduce the panelists, starting from Kevin, my immediate left, is the CEO and co-founder of Elderly Health, Kevin Krauth, a digital startup that has developed a software that leverages machine learning and AI to improve the accuracy of doctor directory data for health insurers. Founded in 2015, Orderly was named one of the top 50 companies to watch by Built In Colorado in 2017 and was invited to join the Denver Scale-Up Network in 2018, an honor reserved to the 10 most promising growth stage company in the Denver area as determined by the Colorado Office of Economic Development. Kevin started his career in investment banking and corporate M&A with Blackstone before migrating to the tech industry in San Francisco, where he acted as a product manager at a SaaS analytics company for clients like Kaiser Permanente, for example. Kevin is a proud graduate of Duke University, and we forgive him for that. Not for busting the brackets, but just for that. Suman Alapati is an accomplished technology leader and consultant with more than 20 years of progressive experience in establishing and executing global IT service strategy and delivery. Suma recently joined Dish Network as Chief Digital Officer, where she leads application delivery and digital strategy implementation. From 2014 to 2018, Suma was Colorado's Secretary of Technology and Chief Information Officer. She received awards from the Colorado Technology Association, Top 25 Most Powerful Women, and 2016 State Executive of the Year. She was also a finalist for Denver Business Journal 2018 Outstanding Women in Business. I'm gonna skip the moderator for a second and introduce Josh Reitzema. He's responsible for the investment strategy for Lockheed Martin Space Special Programs, one of Lockheed Martin's largest line of business comprising of more than 2,000 employees. His key investments are focused on national security space system developments. His driving focus has been implementing AI across space platforms. He earned his master's degree in system engineering from the University of Denver. And lastly, we have Rob Carpenter. He's co-founder and CEO of Valiant AI, creator of Holly, the world's first face-to-face customer service AI that looks and feels like you're talking to a real person. Rob is also the chairman of Appet Ventures, a custom software development company with offices in 3 countries. In 2013, Rob was named one of the top 25 most influential young professionals in Colorado by Colorado Biz Magazine, and in 2016, he received the Denver Trailblazer Award. The discussion tonight will be moderated by Tamara Chuang, co-founder of the Colorado Sun. Tamara has spent the last 2 decades covering technology and business news, primarily for the Denver Post and the Orange County Register. With other fellow journalists, Tamara started the Colorado Sun, a journalist-owned media outlet which relies on member and community support. After a few initial questions from the moderator, I asked 4 colleagues from the University of Denver from 4 different disciplines to ask one question to the panel. And after that, we will all have the opportunity to ask questions. Let me introduce my colleagues very briefly. Dr. Bruce Claw is Assistant Professor of Business Ethics and Legal Study in the Daniels College of Business. A major focus of his research centers on the prevention of corporate crime, an area of study that has led him to grapple with some of the difficult legal and ethical questions raised by algorithmic decision-making in business. Dr. Anamika Barman-Hadikari is Assistant Professor of Social Work at the Graduate School of Social Work. Her research uses big data and AI to understand the social determinants of risk among vulnerable population. Dr. Doug Allen is Associate Professor of Management, along with fellow Management Department Professor Cindy Fukami and Dennis Whitmer, is the co-developer of the course Robotics, AI, and Future of Work. And lastly, Dr. Mohammed Mahor is a Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Rich's School of Engineering and Computer Science. His research is in the area of computer vision and machine learning, including visual object recognition and object tracking. So please join me and welcome our speaker and our DU researcher.
Thanks, Lorenzo, and thanks everyone for coming. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, when Lorenzo asked me to moderate this panel on artificial intelligence and ethics, my mind first went to HAL of 2001. I mean, what better example of ethics there? Blade Runner, all sorts of imagined sci-fi, instances of artificial intelligence and ethics. And we're not going to talk about the fantasy world in sci-fi. I want to focus the conversation on what's happening today, and all these folks here are doing things today at their companies and businesses and in their industries. So I'm just going to start by asking, how are you guys using artificial intelligence at your company, on your job, or even at past jobs? And I'd like to hear from all of you. So you want to start, Kevin?
Start like this?
Sure, yeah. I'll give a quick kind of background on Orderly. So we actually started similar to Rob over there. We were using a form of AI called natural language processing. So we've made a slight pivot in the last 6 months or so. But before this most recent pivot, we were using natural language processing, which is a way to translate what a human is saying into language, into a way that a computer can then understand it. So we created this bot that was in many ways a go-between for members to ask questions and help navigate the healthcare space. And on the one side, they would ask the question, we would translate that and then send it to sources of data on the other side. And in that process, we actually identified a much bigger problem that was much more acute that we could sell to insurance companies, and that was the problem of provider data accuracy. So we've sort of shifted, and we're using natural language processing still, but more from an efficiency standpoint to be able to reach out for what's called provider attestation. So if you've ever seen a doctor, that data comes from your insurance company normally, and that insurance company has to get the provider to attest, to say that their data is accurate. So we can actually call a doctor up, and then they can go through a language-centered IVR, a way of being able to answer questions through this natural language processing system, and then that'll update our record. In addition, we're also using machine learning to be able to quickly identify errors within the data set and programmatically replace them. Instead of having humans pick up the phone to call these doctors to attest to their data, we use basically probabilistic models to identify where that error might be and then replace the erroneous data. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded.
That was great. I will give a broad spectrum of my experience with AI. Just in my previous role as the Secretary of Technology and Chief Information Officer for the state of Colorado. At the state, one of the programs that we have is the Medicaid eligibility program. And a lot of the most vulnerable populations within Colorado use that program to get benefits. They put their food on the table with SNAP benefits, things like that. It's a very, very important program. We used AI and the machine learning capabilities within the programs we created was 5.6 million lines of code or something crazy like that. And we were starting to get AI ML into that program. And one of the biggest benefits that we've seen immediately is cutting down processing times from 45 days to 45 minutes, right? So that is, again, very impactful AI in my mind, where it's impacting citizens and improving the citizens' experience with interacting with government. So that's one of the examples. AI, the way I see it, again, keeping that ethics as a background, is augmented intelligence. Nobody can take intelligence away from human beings. For me, that is the most important aspect of AI. But we are driving machines to mimic that human behavior to a certain extent. One of the things, and actually my daughter is doing, she's a student of DU, so she is actually creating AI ML algorithms to see how we can predict the next mass school shooting. So she's creating patterns, looking at patterns, looking at data, and seeing if there's like predictors and markers that may go up into, and it's a very complex issue, as we know, right? So that's another example of a use case outside of business, outside of just the commercial or enterprise value of AI. And then as part of what I did at the state, when the recipients of what we created as the eligibility program was an organization called Nurse Family Partnership, where single moms who wouldn't get health care or who wouldn't get benefits would take the information that we provided using business intelligence, and they would match up the nurses with providers and things like that. So that's another case, right? So AI, ML, the use cases are disparate, they're diverse, places where you wouldn't normally think they would happen. So, and just within my job at Dish Network, we're using AI, ML capabilities to constantly learn about customer behavior, customer patterns, and try to enhance that customer journey in a digitally enhanced way, right? So customers are demanding a lot. They want the experience to be seamless, and how AI, ML plays a lot in terms of learning patterns, learning the way they interact with systems, and creating a journey, hopefully based on what the machine learns, and create a personalized journey through that whole experience. So.
Great.
So I come from the space industry, and AI in space has long kind of held a pretty significant advantage in that space is a fairly structured environment as opposed to some of the unstructured environments that you guys just described very, very well. So space has led the way in AI in a lot of ways because of that. And but where we are right now is probably in what we would call a narrow AI, which is the AI applications are pretty tailored for a specific job. So we have the NASA Robonaut, which is a humanoid robot that can do extravehicular activities outside the International Space Station. But it's really thought of as a tool that can be used, and those AI techniques can enhance that and make that more efficient. But the broader applications and the broader opportunities are really, can we send up a team of these Robonauts to maybe the moon or Mars and just give them some materials and say, build us a base, we'll be here in 3 years. That's what we see the longer term vision of the AI being. In satellites, which we also build, we are predominantly looking at what we would call the short loop versus the long loop problem. When the long loop is that basically the satellite is observing things, and the data comes down and gets sent to an analyst, and an analyst retasks the satellite. That's a long loop. we see a tremendous opportunity for short loop, where the satellite can make its own decisions and retask itself, and that has some ethics questions. But an example of that may be, let's say a satellite is looking at all the lightning strikes across the Midwest, and it might be able to infer that there's going to be a tornado. And could it retask it in the satellite system to image a city that may be affected by that? And that has some pretty disaster relief implications, and that would be reduce the timeline and have that imagery available immediately, almost immediately in those situations.
Okay.
Cool. For my next company, I'll make sure we're doing some good in the world. For this one, we're making fast food more efficient. We're trying to bring AI into the enterprise. So imagine you pull up to McDonald's, the drive-through speaker is there, and you drop Siri or Google Home into that speaker. It greets you and carries on a conversation. That's what our core 1.0 product is. Just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many people have worked in fast food? Couple? It's a really tough job, or have eaten in fast food and looked through the window. Bad question. If you're working in that drive-through window, you're taking potentially multiple lanes of orders, you're making food, you're putting it into a bag. The next thing you know, the soda drink is overflowing. It's a very, very stressful job. And within the fast food industry, they have 100 to 200% turnover per year. And so what we're focused on is automating one of those tasks, which is specifically that customer conversation. And for the employees, it honestly makes their life better, because over an 8-hour window, you're not taking 400, 500, 600 orders, standing on your feet the entire time, talking to people that are really grouchy and cranky. So we can take that off their plate. And so far, the employees have been the most fervent supporters of our product. Like, even when it's not supposed to be on, they keep trying to turn it on, and we're like, knock it off. Not ready right now. So we're really kind of excited to see that expand out. The next version of our product, and the one that'll be the most disruptive, are essentially kind of true digital employees for inside physical locations. And that was the original genesis of the company. So in our office in Cherry Creek, we have a transparent OLED display. Think of a flat screen TV merged with a piece of glass, and we actually generate a 5.5-foot tall photorealistic person. We use facial recognition to greet you by name. The AI character even shifts weight on its feet, talks with its hands, things like that. And then this conversational AI that we're building for the drive-thru will get remarried back into that infrastructure. So it's going to be very likely in the next 5 years that when you go into a fast food restaurant or a bank or a retailer or a hospital, you'll very likely be greeted by essentially an AI employee that will take your order, check you into your hotel, check you in for your flight, you name it. So it's going to be a pretty big decade.
Very Minority Report.
Yeah.
And a couple others.
Right. Yeah, and as a techie, I feel like, wow, that sounds really cool. But as a skeptical reporter, I feel, wow, so what's going to happen to all those employee jobs? And hearing from you guys, I hear about, well, what about privacy issues and control and safety? So, I was just wondering, can you guys be specific and share an example of how you've had to make an ethical decision with AI in your job or your industry, or maybe something you anticipate happening because of what you do? And I'd like to hear from all of you again.
Yeah, sure. So, I can start with an example that I think is one of the ones that most people sort of identify when you think about AI. So in like self-driving cars, the comment about AI or the impending future that's coming is, how, as a software engineer, do you weigh what happens when a car has to choose between, running over a pedestrian or killing the driver or killing the passenger in the car? Fortunately, we're not at that point yet at Orderly Health. I think for us, the biggest question is really related to data and sharing and privacy. So our new model, in many ways, sidesteps HIPAA, because we're talking about publicly available data, or at least semi-publicly available data when it comes to provider records. So the ethics for us is really more along the lines of like, how do we improve the member experience as best we can? And then I think in the future, what we're already talking about now is marrying quality of outcomes, and similar to kind of what Facebook has been going through in the last year or so is their comeuppance for creating this massive data set to create a really genuinely good experience. I mean, the customers of Facebook are also their product, right? The users really enjoy their experience. Well, for us, what we're talking about is over time, as we collect more data on what doctors you're searching for, what reason you're going to visit them, how often you're going to visit them, where you move about the country, that can create an incredible user experience. Imagine that you move and then you get an email from your insurance company that says, hey, we noticed that you just moved locations. We have all this information about, you have a son with type 1 diabetes and you have hypertension. There's a great primary care physician that's covered under your plan right down the street. Well, that could be very creepy or very magical, right? Depending on how you look at it. So those are the kind of ethical questions that we're facing right now. And I think fortunately we have a little bit of time to figure that out, but it is something that we think about all the time in terms of, what exactly are we doing? How open do we want to be with our members? And I think one of the best ways to combat some of the ethical issues is really just being very, very transparent. So I've even talked about advocating for normalizing legalese, because the joke that nobody reads the Apple terms of service. If you can basically say, like, what you are agreeing to is this, this, and this is how we're going to use your data in a way that makes sense to people, rather than inundating them with a bunch of language that doesn't make any sense. So.
I truly think there's no right and wrong answers, or there's no black and white answers, right? Everything has to be thought out. We as the consumers of information, the consumers of AI, should use our brains when we are putting our data out there. We have to be our fiercest advocates when we are putting our data out there. We need to know and understand, like, with all this convenience and this intelligence comes a lot of risk of privacy and security, and all those things, all those considerations are very, very important. I was actually in a panel at Stanford just last year, and this author, everybody should read this. It's called World Without Mind by Franklin Foer. And he tells in that book how when we use Facebook and all, these companies are utilizing that data to influence our thinking. And we are giving up our freedom of thought to these companies, right? And again, great good can come out of that, but we should be aware of what we are putting out there in terms of our personal data. And if you're willing to risk a few attributes of your data, be it so, but be aware, right? It's your information. Again, as I mentioned, I have created use cases where AI was used for good, but at the same time, that same data can be used to maybe for the wrong reasons, if it falls in the wrong hands, right? So being thoughtful, and we as citizens need to create that public policy around data, around AI, and make sure our voices are heard. It's going to happen if we are going to be active or passive. It's better for us to be active in that conversation. Don't let just the technology companies drive that solution. Be part of that solution and be heard. And that's the biggest, you are the biggest advocate for your data. So how you go about it and how you're part of the conversation, how you're part of the dialogue, and understand that AI is not going to stop because we don't like it. It's going to happen no matter what. Just being very educated about all the things and all the nuances is the way to go.
Well, I think educating yourself, and everyone should figure this out and make their own decisions.
Yep.
But if you want that ease of use, you have to give up some of those.
And I'm the biggest, I love it when Amazon says, customers who bought this also bought that. I'm like, how did it know, right? But it's not a good thing, because I'm sure like it's tracking my preferences, and I do love the shoes that I bought on Wednesday, and then it keeps on giving me like more shoes. I'm like, so.
But on that note, I would say, yes, it's true for the consumer to decide these things, but what about the responsibility of the company? Do they say, hey, let's push it a little further?
and they will continue to push, right? Again,
Should there be a line?
again, it's for us as customers to be, where do you draw the line, right? Again, maybe I shouldn't be on Amazon that much, right? For various other reasons, but again, it's a very delicate line, and you need to know and be aware, I think. And even if you are willing to give up, as I mentioned, a few attributes, as long as you know you're doing that and you're not being blindsided, that's more education going into it rather than just blindly doing things.
I think I just kind of want to follow up on that as well and say it really is on the consumer, I think, because if everybody remembers last year when Mark Zuckerberg, talked in front of the Senate, they're like, hey, how do you make money? And it's like, really? Like, you guys don't understand something that's more than a decade old at this point? And so my guess is it's unlikely, especially with kind of the current political climate and the kind of gridlock, that we're going to get anything like a GDPR in the next few years. For me, I can always kind of notice when there's like a leap in technical capabilities. So a week ago, my wife sent me a text message for a resort that we should go to. Looked good. I looked on it at Google Chrome at work and Google Chrome at home. That evening on Facebook, the ad for that resort popped up.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got it on Facebook that they, can't read any of my data based on whatever settings they give me in the app. And so each time there is some sort of technical leap in the background, it kind of catches you off guard at first, the first time it happens. And so I think it's going to be on us to determine how we want to interact with that. To just kind of wrap up to your question, for us, the next generation of our technology is going to be very, very ethically complex, because we can start pulling out things like sentiment, age, gender. But as the technology gets better, there's conceivable that at some point we could start recognizing consumers purely based on their voice, maybe the sounds of their car that we're picking up, the location of the restaurant that they're at. And then if you start tying in other things like facial recognition, you're getting into biometrics. And in talking to our lawyers, because that's important, it sounds like currently Illinois and California are the only states with any laws on the books around biometric privacy rights. And so that's going to be something both as consumers to be aware of, and for people in here that start their own company or go and work for companies working in AI, that we're going to have to start tracking these. And it's going to be difficult over the next couple of years, because we'll probably end up with a very patchwork ad hoc law structure. And so we're going to have to understand what's going on with those laws in each of the different states, since we don't have anything that's all encompassing.
Right, and I was going to say with Lockheed, I mean, it's more than just your neighborhood. You're up in space.
Yeah. And I am glad that you kind of jumped in there, because I was going to shift it a little bit from the data consumer questions. But I'm in the research and development of AI and robots and how they can interact with different problems that we have as society. And one of the things that I worked on early in my career was search and rescue robots, and how you can send a robot into a disaster area and have it find victims and do things. But for the most part, where we've been in an AI has been, can we even do that, right? Can we get through the rubble? Can we move something, or can we send a camera in close enough to do that? But we're coming to the point where, yes, we can do that, but now we're going to have those robots make real-time decisions outside of a human control loop, because most of what that has been a human saying, yeah, go ahead and stick a robot in there. But now, what if the robot has to make a decision to cut through some rubble, and maybe that risks further injury to the victims? And so those sort of ethical constraints are implementing our design, or are being carried into our designs, and affecting the quality of the AI, and they're very real problems.
Well, I did want, maybe Rob, you can address the ethical debate with taking over jobs, or good, bad.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I know isn't there a presidential candidate who wants to pay everyone money because our jobs are being taken?
The Yang Gang, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Bill Gates is a supporter, and a few others. That's the Universal Basic Income, UBI. The concern is, obviously, we'll have too much automation hitting all at the same time. Two professors in Oxford in 2013 put out a paper that's been widely cited saying that up to 49% of all jobs in the US right now could be automated in the next 5 years. And so the question is, you can send a country into a recession, I think at about 10% unemployment. You start getting wide-scale riots at about 20% unemployment. And so what happens at 50% unemployment? And so that's going to be a very real thing for us to talk about. The other thing Bill Gates mentioned is a tax on every robot or every piece of automation that goes into the enterprise. So that's kind of one side of the equation. You know, the other side is 150 years ago, we were a 98, 99% agrarian society. I don't know about you guys, but like I'm pretty glad that I don't work in a field. Like that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. My office is cushy. I play ping pong. It's great. So yes, there are job losses as technology advances, but at least from the last 100 to 200 years, it's always made the quality of life better and the living experiences better. So I think we need to be careful that we don't just knee-jerk and say automation is automatically bad and it's going to ruin everybody's life, because very likely it's going to create all kinds of new jobs that never existed before. Think, you know, prior to social media, what was a social media manager? You know, that job title didn't exist 12 years ago. So who knows what types of new jobs are going to be created out of this environment? And then generally speaking, in a capitalist society, that is the way that we kind of push a lot of things, is that we automate things. A job that, you know, took 10 people, now one person can do. The classic example around this would be like Ford with the Model T, and he was one of the first people to kind of put in the manufacturing processes, and there were actually riots at his factories because he was able to lay off a bunch of people that he didn't need anymore. But what that did is it decreased the cost of the product, so then more people could buy it, so then they had to open up more lines. So the parts of the line that couldn't be automated then got replicated across all these other lines as more Model Ts were getting made. And ultimately, Ford ended up creating more jobs than he lost. So I think my summary response is, let's be cautious to make sure that it's not all hitting at the same time and we end up with 50% unemployment. But let's also not demonize AI, robots, and automation by knee-jerk, because there's a very real likelihood it'll just make everybody's lives better versus worse.
Well, maybe Isuma, you can say something since you worked for the government for a long time. There's a lot of people in Colorado, obviously, and I mean, how does a government approach this sort of, you know, automation versus an AI versus?
And I was like actually very lucky to work for Governor Hickenlooper, who embraced AI, right? And he actually created a workforce. A campaign around the workforce and the future of workforce with AI. And again, that's because he was technically oriented. He was very relevant with the times, and he wanted to make sure that we got ahead of the curve rather than wait for things to happen to us. So there was a lot that happened within that, and how we shift our skill sets, right? We have to like empower our citizens and our employees at the state to have this new skill set, a new mindset. And there was like a lot of education around that, right? And it boils down to, again, partnership, public-private partnerships. I know we worked together at the state, and again, we at the state may not have had the resources or the research that a DU or a private company would do it, but bringing those partners together, we educated ourselves that way. And I'm very proud of the work that went into these kinds of initiatives under Governor Hickenlooper, and I know Governor Polis is the same way, right, rather than fight it. And then the public policy working with within our legislators and senators. I was very surprised when Mark Zuckerberg were asked those questions, but I was not surprised too, because I would go testify in front of the committees, Joint Budget Committee and Joint Technology Committees, talking about cloud, and they didn't know what the cloud was, right? So we had to educate them, and similarly, I think, you know, the more we bring awareness, and it's our responsibility, it's our collective responsibility. If our lifestyles are going to be changed and it's going to impact us whether we accept it or not, I think it's imperative for us to be part of those partnerships, create that robust dialogue where it's needed, and be ready for the change because it's coming.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those things, but I do want to put a little bit of a spin on it too. I think, you know, one of the things about pursuing capitalism at all costs is, you know, capitalism is a structure by which we're you know, distributing scarce resources, right? So I totally agree that we need to embrace AI as a potential job creator and how it's going to change our lives in the future. But at the same time, many of the trends that we talk about with these disruptive, innovative technologies, I mean, there's a reason that innovation is called disruptive, because it disrupts things, and that causes short-term pain for a lot of people. So just adding on what both of you guys said, I think from a policy standpoint, it's important for us not only as individuals to be aware of what's happening in terms of our data use and that sort of thing, but also being cognizant of the fact that many of these macro trends, they aren't, nobody lives in a macro. Like, we are all humans, and there's no such thing as like empathetic capitalism, right? So the way that we can structure it is to come up with thoughtful policies. I think what you were saying about Bill Gates, as I understand his position is taxing these robots in a similar way that you would tax a workforce, and then using that money to redeploy for training for new opportunities. Because when somebody loses their job on the line at a fryer for McDonald's or something like that, they're not going to be super happy if they don't have a job for the next 6 months. And taking a universal basic income is probably not a great consolation if it means that they're going to sustain unemployment longer. So I do think that it's important as we're doing this, is both as the innovators and the perpetrators of the disruption, that we should also be thoughtful and supportive of means of both helping the transition to the new economy and making sure that people aren't falling through the cracks.
Yeah.
That has to be thoughtful policy.
That seems fair.
If I can add one more thing, I'm very
Yeah.
passionate about this. The digital divide between Silicon Valley and rural America is real. So we understand all of the nuances because we live that world, and we are constantly in the middle of the action. During my previous tenure, I was able to interact with citizens from Pueblo, Grand Junction, and other rural areas, and the jobs, the lack of jobs, and the lack of education, the lack of broadband, right? Things that AI runs on, it creates a real divide. And we need to make sure that we uplift and take those citizens along with us, because Silicon Valley, they're in those boardrooms deciding on all these things without looking at the real America, the real world. And that is, I think, us as the intellectuals and people who are thinking about these should bring those people along with us. Only then this is a real conversation. We can't do things to people.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're thinking about that, and all of you. We're going to bring up our first professor, Dr. Mohammed Mahor. And you can come up here and ask your question. Oh, I think
He's
that
more
mic
important.
is working. Yeah, he teaches, and you do research on computer vision and machine learning, so you're going to help us understand AI, how it's used today.
Yes. All right, so my question is for Rob. And your conversational AI sounds very cool. In fact, I use something similar to that in building the social robot in my lab for conversation with elderly people. So my question is about users' privacy. So do you record any users' voices and also facial videos and so on and so forth? And if you do so, shouldn't I know about it? And is there any privacy issue here?
It's a big question, and obviously the basic answer is yes. So for our core product right now, it is built and trained off of real live customer audio. And so when we were looking to build our own conversational AI assistant, what we did is we went and installed computers at several of the restaurant locations of our first customer, and then just started remotely recording conversations between the employee and the customer. We then anonymously fed that up to a server, and then we use that to feed into our machine learning algorithms to train the system. It obviously comes from a good place and a good intention, is that you want to be able to understand the entire customer base and not have some of the problems that we've seen in AI where it only understands specific subgroups of the population. And we achieve that. We don't have any specific groups where we have a hard time listening and understanding, but it does raise some ethical questions around that. Now, at least for the current version of our technology, there's no PII or personally identifiable information beyond just your voice print, saying, I want a cheeseburger. We're not currently doing anything with facial recognition, but as I mentioned, that is on our roadmap, and we are starting to look at both the ethical side and the legal side of how we would roll something out like that. And not only is it going to have to be opt-in, but then you're going to have to structure some way for people to opt out and let them see the data that they have and things like that. So there's going to be some complicated things for us to work through.
Thank you. So, and my other question is about security. So let's say a customer says that I wanted to kill you. So how the system is going to recognize, this threat, and what is going to happen? Is the system going to call 911, or what do you want?
So we affectionately refer to our AI as Holly, and I think her knee jerk could be like, well, I'm in Virginia at an AWS server farm, so I'm okay. So with our system, currently we employ human in the loop. So think about self-driving cars, right? You still have somebody that's in the driver's seat that can take over, or per California law, you at least have to have somebody in a remote operation center that can take over. So because we are making our first moves into the enterprise, we can't be losing money for these companies, so we have to be able to guarantee accuracy, which is the reason that we've been able to get to the market so fast. And so for us, it's going to be really important from a security perspective as this thing is growing, that as we are collecting more and more information, that we're not only safeguarding that information, but then determining how we handle sketchy edge cases. For example, somebody threatening violence. That could either be our employee that's the human in the loop listening that can call emergency services, or inside the restaurant, the employees actually listen to the entire conversation between the AI and the customer so that they can start making the burger as soon as the customer asks for it. So at that point, the employee would hear whatever the threat was from the customer and lock down the facility and call emergency services. So part of the benefit of being in this drive-through environment is we hope we get away from some of those types of situations, which you see more in the consumer environments and things like that.
And I have one more question. So
Yeah.
assuming that the accuracy of the system is 100%, so is there still human being in the loop, or you're going to exclude?
When it's 100%, there probably will not be a human in the loop.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next question is coming from Dr. Doug Allen. He's the co-developer of the course Robotics, AI, and the Future of Work. He's going to ask a question to help us understand the benefits and drawbacks of adopting AI at work and diversifying hiring strategy.
Yes, and first of all, I'd like to just thank all of you for the excellent discussion that we've had so far, and it's already danced around some of the issues that I'm interested in exploring in a little bit more detail. And my question is for Suma. At the Daniels College of Business, we're, among many other things, training leaders to prepare for the very future that you've been discussing up here on the stage, where AI is not only a tool, but a disruptor in the workplace. So the question would be, how will AI affect the jobs and the workplace moving forward? And from an ethical standpoint, what is the responsibility of businesses to help manage that transition? So the question is less about whether it's a good thing to introduce the AI or not, but as we do introduce these new powerful technologies, what is the responsibility that comes along with that introduction to make sure that workers are not left behind?
Yep, great question,
Yeah.
Professor. So I think businesses are very aware, especially at Dish Network, as this is happening to us real time. There's a big focus on training, right? And the unemployment rates in the technology field, especially in these, is like almost negative unemployment. So we're not able to find people that have the expertise, that have the skill set to do AI and stuff like that. So what we are trying to do is repurpose and reskill our workforce and invest in the human capital, right? There's nothing that can beat human capital, and train them in these new technologies and train them for the future. So that's one of the strategies. And diversity and inclusion, right? Those are very important, not just in terms of AI, but just how we deal with our workforce. And I think we're actually using AI to help us be more inclusive and more diverse. So we're using those categories. But again, as I mentioned, it is changing, it is coming. The way we go about it is through education, through partnerships, through collaboration, through policy, all those things, and working very closely with our human chief people officers and bringing them into the conversations and not make it just a technology conversation. There's an ethical part. There's change is always very, very tough. Change is about feelings, and how do you manage them, and how do you take your workforce along with you? And as AI evolves, the skill set should evolve, and it should keep growing and diversifying. So just being very current with our education and training.
Okay, thank you. And then just a quick follow-up. The net impact of AI over, let's say, the next 10 to 15 years, as you're kind of looking out into the workplace, are you projecting a net increase in jobs as a result of AI and technologies, or a net decrease in jobs overall?
Having been in technology for 23 years and having seen the evolution from mainframe to now to the cloud, I see, and I predict, and I'm hoping I'm right, that there will be an increase in jobs. As the quality of life improves, there will be more and more use cases, right? There are populations within the remote corners of the world that still need medicine. And I think we can focus a lot of the AI use cases on improving the lives of not just the people around us, but people in the remote corners, improving broadband access, improving treating cancer, beating cancer, those things. I think the jobs will increase.
Thank you very much.
Great. Our next professor, Dr. Anamika Barmadgari. Okay. Her research is devoted to the prevention of HIV and substance use among high-risk youth and other vulnerable populations. We'll be asking a question about, to help us understand the social norms of whether AI is ready to complement them, or whether humans are willing to leave social norms to a computer.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. Social work is usually not represented in these settings, so I'm happy to be here and represent social sciences here. So a lot of times when we talk about AI, we talk about its commercial uses, and I feel like this question is, I originally intended it for Kevin, but also now Suma, given your experiences with the government. So I wanted to pivot a little and talk about how AI can be used for the social good and to address tricky, complex social issues. I mean, it's already being used for suicide prevention. Yes. Facebook is using an AI, machine learning, natural language processing algorithm for that. But it's an area which is murky and not well thought out of. So I guess, and as a social science researcher, I've been trying to use AI, but what I have learned in the process is that using and scaling up AI for social good will require overcoming a lot of barriers, especially because nonprofit organizations don't have the resources to hire people who have AI expertise. The government has been slow to respond to these challenges because of the bureaucratic structure. And also there are ethical dimensions. It has been used in the criminal justice system, and what it has shown is that AI can amplify existing social biases. So I guess my question is broad. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about how do we see applying AI in the service of public good? Who defines what is the public good? And how do you anticipate overcoming kind of the ethical, logistical aspects of using AI and developing effective and genuine public-private partnerships to tackle those issues?
Want to take that, Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Who's got time? No, that's okay. I think you're touching on, as you mentioned, it's a really broad topic, and I think it's one that doesn't have really any easy answers. I would say just from the health perspective, I think that there's a number of applications of AI that is allowing it to scale, and actually in many ways, you mentioned that there are indications of AI presenting biases or amplifying biases. Well, in some cases, for things like image recognition, in the case of healthcare diagnosis, it can actually remove biases because basically it's just looking at pattern recognition and pixels and images. So I think that there's a lot of applications when it comes to pattern recognition for cellular development and image recognition and all the applications that come down to diagnosis, which if implemented properly and thoughtfully, which fortunately we actually do have. This is so crazy for me to say, fortunately, we have a bureaucratic structure that prevents us from diving too deep on the healthcare space. Right. I mean, it is, if anybody has seen what's it called? The Inventor, the HBO documentary, or read Bad Blood about Theranos, the story of Theranos is pretty widely circulated, and it was the case that really our incredibly bureaucratic structure in the healthcare space saved countless lives from a product that just wasn't ready for the mainstream from going out. And so in some ways, it allows me to temper my impatience when I see things like that. I do think what you said, and again, I can't answer all of your questions, but I do think what you said about there being ways that it can amplify problems and setting appropriate boundaries is something that we need to dive deeper on. And I think having that be a part of the public discourse, and it is for particularly related to healthcare and nonprofits. I think it's really, really important that we don't just go hog wild on what AI can do. I think back about that famous quote from Jurassic Park where he's like, you were so busy worrying about whether you could, you didn't stop to think whether you should.
Right.
So I think for us, it's important for, and I say us, I don't mean orderly, I mean everyone in this room to be an active participant in the policies that are going on, paying attention to what's happening with Facebook and Google and automated driving and space robotics and all of that. And it's interesting, but we all have to be active participants in governing the kind of future that we want to be a part of. So I think that's sort of a pat answer, but hopefully it touches on some of the things you were talking about.
It does.
We can. This is a much longer conversation.
Yes.
Did you have anything to add?
Yeah,
Sumit?
just I'm a mom of teenagers, so what happened at STEM school a couple of weeks ago, that was real, right? Mental health, if we are not able to resolve that through AI or something, we have failed as a society. Our kids are suffering.
Right.
There's so much trauma, right? And people immediately gravitate towards guns versus not, but just that. So AI for social good. I hope as a mom that we find some solution to the suffering of our kids and what's happening. It's real. So.
Yeah, I would love to follow up on this conversation. We don't have time now, but thank you.
Thank you.
Next is Dr. Bruce Clough. His research grapples with the difficult legal, ethical, and governance questions raised by algorithmic decision-making in business, and hopefully your question is going to focus on how AI can help strategize, help with strategy and business impact.
That's right. This question is initially for Josh.
Yes.
As artificial intelligence models increase in complexity and gain access to the troves of training data being generated and gathered daily, they can often spot patterns in the underlying data that are otherwise not evident. This functionality can lead to increased problem-solving ability and predictive accuracy. However, as complexity increases, it can also become difficult to interpret how and why AI reaches the results that it does. And without the ability to meaningfully understand AI results, it can be difficult to correct for the potential societal concerns that we've been talking about here, like bias, discrimination, distributive fairness. Knowing that the loss of predictive ability or accuracy comes at a cost to business, how should companies seek to address this tension or trade-off between predictive accuracy or predictive ability and interpretability of results?
So I kind of like to think of that problem as trying to understand why a Bach symphony is so beautiful. It's like trying to understand why an AI algorithm came up with the results it did. And if we can't do that, how can you address the ethical questions, right? If you can't definitively say how an algorithm made a choice, how are you supposed to make an ethical program, right? So to specifically answer your question about how we address that, I don't think we field algorithms that we don't know how it came up with a result. So until we feel confident that that's an answered question for any product that we may have, that wouldn't be released. So it would be in a testing facility. But then there are ways to kind of delve into those algorithms, into the hidden layers, and understand what the hidden layers are doing, and also program the algorithm so that it is giving you a path that it took to get to its decision along with the decision. It's not just a black box that X and then outcomes Y. You're getting X and outcomes Y, and here's kind of how we got that result. And here's our thought process. Here was the AI's thought process for that. So if you can understand that and you can study that, then you start to have the makings of the ability to verify that your algorithm is doing what it wants to do and is acting ethically in the manner that you want it to act.
Go ahead.
Yep.
So I was just going to say too. I mean, it's a big question, and for those situations where it is a black box, I think you just want to look at what is that output, and then just what's your gut? Like, does that feel right? So an example is Amazon spent millions of dollars building this application that would screen the tens of thousands of incoming resumes and recommend the best potential hires. And it was built off of an analysis of all of their best hires inside the company. Well, the problem with that is that obviously in most of the tech environments, you're at 90-ish% male. And so what happened is you came out with an extremely sexist product that only was recommending men to be hired. And so you may not understand what happened in that black box, but just gut check it, and if it's wrong on the output, then you need to rework something and start moving it closer to where it should be from an ethical standpoint.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, there's a great example when Notre Dame lit on fire, I don't know, like a month ago, maybe not that long ago, but so all of these tech companies, many of them are using AI as recommendation engines, which makes sense because if you're YouTube or Facebook or whatever, Instagram, you can't possibly have humans screening all of the content, all of the things that are being posted all the time. So I think that to answer your question, I would say that we are both seeing, and there needs to be some responsibility on the corporate side, not only because they should step back and not maximize profits without heeding the potential costs to that, but also because in the long run, it actually might hurt them. So going back to the Notre Dame example, when it was on fire, so YouTube uses an algorithmic search mechanism to make recommendations based on the video that you're watching. So the smoke patterns and the way that Notre Dame looked was very reminiscent of 9/11. So then immediately it started recommending 9/11 and all these other conspiracy theorist videos, and of course that led to conspiracy theories popping up that it was some sort of like Muslim attack, and they immediately pulled them down. And not only that, they've actually paused for several days the algorithmic search results for anything related to fires until they could figure it out, because they knew that in the long run that was going to hurt their bottom line. So it is a balance between ethical decision making and profit maximization. And sort of seeing that play out, I think, is really interesting. And I think Silicon Valley has to grapple with those decisions.
And just to that point, I think they're adding titles now, or people called chief ethical officers, chief privacy officers, totally new jobs being created based on this. So.
Great. Can I ask another additional question?
Yes.
Great. Take my opportunity while I've got it. So policymakers in the US and around the globe are beginning to focus on the opportunities, risks, and transformative impact of AI technologies and algorithmic decision-making. The EU, for example, has implemented the General Data Protection Regulation to enhance consumer rights around personal data and AI decisions. In China, the State Council and various government ministries have released plans outlining the ways in which the central government intends to support the development of AI, including ensuring access to the troves of data necessary for AI. And in the United States, the California Consumer Privacy Act was signed into law in 2018. The Federal Trade Commission is re-examining its possible role as a watchdog. And bills have been recently introduced in the Senate that would require big companies to test the, quote, algorithmic accountability of their high-risk AI systems or notify consumers prior to the use of facial recognition software. So my question, I guess, for all of you is, what role, if any, do you believe that government should play in the development and or regulation of AI technologies?
Well, I'll take the first stab at it. I think the government needs to play a very critical role in that process, because at the end of the day, a lot of private companies are trying to appease our investors, our shareholders, and that tends to nudge us towards kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. And I think laws are a wonderful way to say, here is the boundary, and this is, we shouldn't go past this line. And it creates a level playing field then between all of the companies. Obviously, you want to do what's right, not take that kind of ethically dubious step. But then if you're in a heated competitive battle, take a Lyft and an Uber, and the other one does it, and suddenly you're not raising money anymore, you're now sacrificing potentially 10,000 jobs if you're a big tech company for all those people that work for you. So I think laws can be helpful in kind of evening the playing field in intensely competitive environments.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's hard because we were talking about it earlier that you gave the example of the Senate hearing where Mark Zuckerberg looks sort of glassy-eyed like, what, we sell ads. I think it is important to have some very clear legal boundaries, and I sort of think of it as almost like an insurance policy, right? Like you go out there, not in the sense that you buy it after the fact, but in the sense that when you look through an insurance policy, there's a reason why every possible scenario is kind of covered, right? Because right now, I don't think we fully understand some of the implications of some of these AI, like the example of the self-driving car and what happens when a crash is imminent. So now what does the software do? And thinking through issues of liability in those cases and putting in a legal framework by which, like in that case, does Google get blamed? Does the car owner get blamed? Does who gets? Is it the insurance? Who pays for it? So I think that it is really important to have a good legal framework, and I think that in creating laws, it also helps us as the innovators to know where the boundaries are. So I don't think that you can recklessly go about it the way that the Facebook. We feel like I'm picking on Facebook a lot, but the whole move fast and break stuff. I think that we've sort of seen that they moved fast and broke a lot of things, and now they have to pay for it. The legal framework does need to catch up, and that will help spur innovation as we understand what are the borders that we're allowed to operate in.
Yeah, and just picking on Facebook, right? Sorry.
Keep at it.
Keep at it.
Why not here?
Yeah, I'm sure he's watching me
Yeah,
right
exactly.
now. So, but just I think it created an awareness, right, on government participation. We don't like regulation. We want our freedoms, but at the same time, when our voter data was infringed upon, we all got mad, and we should have taken even further action, right? So those are the repercussions of us being complacent. We have to have boundaries. We have to have balance. It's not all about the capitalism. And having been in government, some of these people are truly wanting to make a difference, and that's why they work in government. We just need to give them a chance to do their jobs. So,
Josh, is there a proactive role that government can play to support the development of these technologies other than sort of serving as a policeman role?
Yeah, I mean, well, I was going to add, and one thing I was going to say about this is that the laws that apply to AI are not the same laws that apply to us humans. And one example of that is back to the self-driving car. If you tell a self-driving car that it must make a stop and wait for the intersection to be clear, well, there's probably circumstances where the AI is just going to be paralyzed and frozen and can't actually drive it further because it's sort of a busy road or something, right? So the laws are a little bit different, and you have to word them different. And so to your question, I think that is an active area of research, and that needs to be addressed by our government, and should be, those laws should be studied and created alongside it.
I think one more final point, too, about government being proactive is that then that kind of brings it back to that idea of a UBI, and that something like that might be necessary, and that's going to take a long time to put that type of infrastructure together. So I think we should, plan for the worst and hope for the best. So government today should be working on some sort of at least an intellectual framework of how a system like that could work. And as far as I'm aware of, they're not, and it's being left up to private companies like Y Combinator in the Valley and some Northern European countries to actually test these systems out and see if they're even viable Plan Bs or not. So that's another area where government should be really involved.
and government can be technical, right? They invented the internet, so it's not that they don't know what is going on. So.
Great. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
And I feel like, all these topics that have come up could be their own panel discussion, but I wanted to make sure there's time for questions from the audience. So are you going to take okay, great. If anyone have a question for panelists here?
Thank you all for being here. I'm Bart Alexander. And let's pick up this thread of how should this new technology be established, how should boundaries be established? You've talked about the role of government, and that's very hopeful, but you've also, the rate of change and the rate of development of this technology is going to make it very difficult for regulatory agencies, let alone legislators, to really understand what the new boundaries need to be. And you talked about the roles of consumers. We've heard there's some consumers who are very savvy and some who don't really have a clue. So then you've also talked about your own companies and other companies doing best practices and very impressive practices, including chief privacy officers or chief ethics officers, or your own ethical reviews as you're going through technologies. But that's the ceiling, not the floor. So my question is, what's the role of industry self-regulation in establishing a floor?
Do you want the optimistic answer or the pessimistic answer? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the optimistic answer is you hope that the companies continue to take this on themselves. And we've seen massive breaches in trust from companies like Facebook. And we talk about move fast and break things. What have they broke? Well, democracy in certain parts of the world have been broken. And so there is a huge ethical responsibility for these companies to take that on. The pessimistic side is, generally speaking, in a capitalist environment, you are looking for automation, you are looking for efficiencies, you are looking for ways to get profit margins so that you can attract a SoftBank to come in and, you know, give you $5 billion or something like that. So I hope industry will do it, but I am an optimistic person, but I'm not 100% sure that they will do it with AI, which is why government is so important.
Yeah, I think I'll add to that, and I think this might be a cop-out of an answer. I think the floor does need to be set by companies, but I think that when, so the expression is that trust is gathered in drops and lost in buckets. If you're an organization who has a profit-driven incentive, then you should be seeking the trust of your customers, right? So in many ways, I think there are mechanisms that are already in place within capitalism. Again, we're all, you know, optimists up here, I guess. But in many ways, there's built-in mechanisms and incentive structures for capitalism to say, you know, if you screw up so badly that you're really harming all these people, hopefully that only happens once. And I think that the upshot of that is that it, you know, once it happens, depending on how bad it is, it might not be enough for you just to go bankrupt, right? And that's, again, it's the cop-out of the answer is that we need to be realistic about white-collar crime the same way we are with blue-collar crime, right? That's what I would argue, right? Is that the people who are in charge of you know, evaporating trillions of dollars from the economy should be held to account and go to jail, you know, when somebody who has a dime bag of marijuana outside of Colorado goes to jail for the same thing. So I think that there are policies that you don't necessarily need to be a technocrat in the government to be able to design policies that say, look, we know that this is wrong. We know that fleecing people or stealing their data or doing things that are going to have really massive negative repercussions. There are ways to devise laws that don't necessarily have to get into the nitty-gritty of the AI, and we can still use those to hold people to account.
And listen to those whistleblowers, right?
Yeah.
And give your employees a voice so that when they see things that they feel is not right, they at least feel heard, and then, you know, you can be proactive and preventive with some of these issues from going out of hand.
Yeah, real quick too, like the whistleblower protections, I think is a wonderful addition. Theranos was stopped by whistleblowers. Like, who knows how many lives they could have destroyed if those employees hadn't spoken up. And so that's a great example of where the government stepped in and did something that I think really helped to kind of rein industry back a little bit.
Any other questions? One way.
Gonna throw the mic.
Hello. So as AI has developed, it seems like it's kind of come into two different areas, the designers and the implementers. And it seems like the US has been leading the design part, and countries like Japan and China are leading the implementation part of that. So I was wondering what your opinions are on foreign investment in like US startups for AI and things like that.
I mean, I can start.
Is that clear enough?
Yeah,
Kind
I
of just
think so.
wondering, like, should we focus, maybe have the vision be get the U.S. to be masters of AI first, and then try to get it in the globe, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a couple assumptions that you're making that you could argue the basis of those assumptions, which I won't do because I'm fine with agreeing with you for the purposes of this conversation. But I think I think when we talk about economic impact of AI, there are all these sort of secondary and tertiary repercussions, right? And I don't think that we've really fully thought those through. I do think that as we have advanced in our economy, we've moved away from being this manufacturer economy. And I kind of think of that as being a similar analogy to what you're asking about, right? We are a services industry. So I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I don't think it's a bad thing at all for us to be the leaders in terms of the design on AI, like the technical aspects or how it's driven. I was actually meeting with an investor not too long ago, and they have a thesis specifically focused on AI. And I had never heard this before, but he said, one of our theses is that AI is a commodity, and it's just a matter of choosing the algorithms. So if AI is a commodity, then it's going to be actually the implementers who are going to end up, winning because they can. You're always going. It doesn't matter who leads it unless you can somehow make that defensible. So I do think that the U.S. leading the charge on the design side is a good thing for now, but we have to be attentive to the fact that this is eventually going to get exported. And what do we do? How do we make sure that we still get some of the benefits of that, rather than just exporting it to places like China and Japan in the long run? I don't know if that answered your question.
And it's a global technology right now, so I don't think its design is just limited to US. I think there's a lot that's happening in Japan from a design thinking perspective as well. So, and that's the beauty, if you will, of what technology advances we've done in the last several years and decades is there's a lot of awareness among other countries too, and they're leading a lot of this disruptive, innovative thinking as well. So how we exchange those ideas and how we come up with a global perspective, I think is going to be very important.
Thank you.
Well, I know Lorenzo wanted me to wrap up around now, but keep going. If there's anyone with another question, there's one right there.
Hi, thank you. Question, I guess it goes more towards Josh. With artificial intelligence coming in, at what point does it become fully self-aware of itself without human interaction? Does that become dangerous? Because if it thinks like a human, how do we know that it makes ethical decisions?
Yeah, right.
Are you guys building Skynet?
Yeah.
I guess that's a way
yeah,
to look at it.
I think that is at the crux of the ethics question there, that as we get to that broad AI and the full definition of AI, where it's making decisions and acting and creating its own outcomes, that is the ethical question, right? So I think how we guard against that is a lot of what we just talked about. I mean, how we put some protections in place through maybe laws or in corporate responsibilities, but there are going to be situations where that comes up soon, and how we respond to that as a country and industry is going to be, yeah.
I guess like a follow-up for it, how do you unplug it at that point?
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, so in my opinion, where AI is right now is we have the ability to unplug it. There's an algorithm that some researchers were, can't remember which university, but some researchers were training it on the World Wide Web and doing some language processing and teaching it to pick up the language and start speaking, right? And all of a sudden it started speaking very racist, and but they were able to pull the plug, right? So what happens when we can't pull the plug? And that is, I think right now we've designed systems such that we can pull the plug, and there's a human in the loop, like from every AI algorithm that we can put in. But.
And I just want to jump in too, and you're going to get different perspectives on this, but if you're truly talking about consciousness, you have some of the smartest people in the field that don't even think that's ever going to happen, or it's going to be 100 years. I believe it was OpenAI about 2 years ago, had a conference down in like Costa Rica, and they brought in like 200 or 300 of the top AI researchers, and they asked the group of like, when do you think AI will achieve consciousness? And the soonest was like 20 to 30 years, with a lot of people saying 100 to never. So you have really vocal people like Elon Musk saying that it's coming. Just like the UBI, it doesn't hurt to plan for it. My own experiences working with AI is it's so dumb right now. It is super dumb. It is just the smoke and mirrors of intelligence that you are seeing in current systems right now. So global warming is going to be a problem way before conscious AI is going to be a problem.
Go ahead.
Other questions?
You've indicated that you think that government intervention or government rulemaking or some statutes are needed to help companies understand what their responsibilities are, what the limits are, or allocate risk in different sorts of situations. But since all of you are in private enterprises right now, I mean, do you really want government to enact some sort of law setting standards for you when just as you're indicating, technology is just starting to be developed, and it's going to move pretty fast. I mean, it's moving quickly now, but it's going to move faster and faster. There are going to be more changes, and I think we all recognize that government doesn't respond very quickly in most cases. And how do you react to having a set of standards when all of a sudden you say the technology is outpaced the laws or the regulations? In privacy and cybersecurity right now, there are some court decisions that say you've got to have a reasonable plan in place to protect privacy, and sort of we know what reasonableness looks like, sort of. Are you willing to live with standards? Do they help you deal with issues that you are currently dealing with or that you foresee? Or do you really need guidelines and regulations that set firm, black and white lines?
So I can start. I think that what I was saying earlier in terms of setting the boundaries, in many ways that gives a lot of guidance and freedom to develop solutions in an area where you don't really have a good understanding of what are the consequences of this going wrong, right? I mean, it's not like, going to the last question, we're very, very far from AI basically like turning on itself and then running amok, right? But the questions of things like liability for an incorrect, so giving the example in healthcare, if there's an incorrect diagnosis because the AI picks up pattern recognition wrongly and it identifies a tumor as benign when it's actually malignant, then what is the liability there, right? If there's a law in place that says your liability is this much, then you might say, okay, well, I'm willing to take that risk, or no, I'm not, depending on what the law states. So to your question, yes, in many cases, bureaucracy can make it harder to do business. And I'm not advocating for like a massive government state that tells us everything that we can and can't do. But I do think that in the cases where you're on the fringe and you're dealing with things like people's health and well-being, it is really important to know how far you can push the envelope without completely ruining your company, right? So having those boundaries is really important. And I think it's a matter of perspective. It's not necessarily saying that like the laws are going to solve everything. I don't think that's the case. Nor do I think it's the case that the laws are going to tell us what we're going to do. I think that until there are those boundaries set, companies, certainly companies that have to do with ethical questions like life and death, are going to err on the side of extreme caution, because a life is not worth any amount of risk, right?
And just as an example, Colorado Blockchain Council, when blockchain was introduced as a technology, we formed a public-private partnership along with industry and education institution. It's called the Colorado Blockchain Council, because blockchain as a technology is so new and the use cases are so new. So we went about and started researching what the privacy should look like, what the use cases should look like, and how we influence laws and public policy around blockchain, right? So that's a starting point. It's not great, right? I mean, compared to cybersecurity with the SANS Institute and what they do in terms of the top 20 security controls, which are very good guiding factors. These evolving emerging technologies don't have those, but I think people are paying attention, and I think right things are happening, maybe not at the pace that we want.
And one more quick one too is self-driving cars. That's an industry where those companies have asked for regulation because they don't want uncapped liability. If they're going to hit a crowd of people and they've got 5 and 5, so 5 people are going to die, that's a whole lot of lawsuits right there. And so those are areas where AI companies really want regulation.
I mean, I hear what you're all saying, and I think that as technology changes and grows, and you look at self-driving cars, there are probably some new technologies that'll come along in a few years that none of us are even thinking about right now. And just, again, can the legal framework keep up with technology as it moves really fast? Or, instead of having laws that really set boundaries, is it better, and I just throw this out, I'm not saying it is, but to have frameworks that private industry works with. Now, of course, that assumes that businesses are going to act in good faith and in the sort of best interest of both the business and the public, and sometimes those don't coincide very well. So those are always problems.
More questions?
You okay, Lorenzo? So one more question. Why don't we go up there? She's been raising her. Oh, well. Sorry. Okay, 2 more questions.
I'm just touched by we live in Highlands Ranch, and the STEM school thing is real. It's real in our generation. And you started the conversation that you can't replace human connection. Yeah. We never will be able to replace human connection. So what are the responsibilities for AI development to balance the interpersonal strategy around a technology? For example, is AI playing into some of the disconnect that those teenagers are feeling? Rather than being a part of the solution, is AI ever a part of the problem when it comes to human connection? Because we all know that no robot can replace affection and touch and the social necessities of Maslow's needs. And so how do we create balance for creating interpersonal strategy that is in alignment with the efficiencies of AI? Because robots cannot do for the human condition and the spirit that humans can do.
That's a great, I'm going to answer just because I'm passionate about it, right? I think maybe if we use AI for improving our lives, so we can get home faster in a self-driving car, and it finds parking for us, so we don't, we're not stressed. Maybe we spend that time, quality time with our kids, nurturing them, making the best use of our time with us, right, rather than be always on the phones. So, there's so many complex factors that went into that shooting. So I think, again, maybe we focus our energies on those kinds of things, on nurture.
Yeah, I think going back to what Rob was saying earlier about AI being very, very far from being sentient, empathetic in any way. AI, everything that we talked about with AI is, the way you could define it is it's mimicry. It's like, that's like saying a parrot knows English because it repeats stuff back to you. But that's not the case. So I think that there are ways to, decrease loneliness from the standpoint of having bots that allow you to talk to them. In Josh's example, I think it was Microsoft created a bot on Twitter that became really racist and they had to pull it down. Yeah, because what you're seeing, and it was actually a question that was asked up here too, what we're seeing with AI is the tendency toward, if AI is simply mimicry, then it will gravitate toward whatever it sees the most of, right? So in the case of a stuffed animal that coos and nurtures a baby, that could be a great application for AI that doesn't have a ton of terrible downsides. On the flip side, if you have an AI that's no human in the loop, that's there for cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's getting told all of these horrific stories of trauma, then there needs to be some boundaries placed on it so that it doesn't run amok. And I think, I think your question is a good one. It is, we are very, very far away from having AI replace humans, and hopefully we all take comfort in that.
Think of AI as a tool, like the internet. It can be used for good or for ill.
So I said that one last question up there, the woman in the jean jacket.
So I was able to take a class recently on the business, ethical, and legal implications of driverless mobility. So one of the ethical issues that we talked about was people who have disabilities and like are deaf or the elderly, and being able to like access these cars and, you know, like having room for their wheelchair and having like not a person to assist them in the car. So I was wondering, how do you guys like develop technology that would incorporate people with disabilities so they're able to have the same accessibility to these different, like, you know, different things like that?
So for us, I mean, we're taking fast food orders, right? Like, we're not making the world a better place. In fact, if our system doesn't work, it probably makes somebody live a little bit longer. But there are some basic things that we can do. So our software, it doesn't currently do it yet, but it has the ability to speak 30 different languages, right? So that breaks down barriers and it makes it easier for people to interact with it. One of our new hires that's a machine learning engineer, he's working on American Sign Language using facial recognition or computer vision. So that's an example where, just like people with disabilities and self-driving cars, you're breaking down barriers. And once we move beyond the fast food example, then you're talking about the ability to check into a hotel or get directions around a grocery store, getting help, you know, at the doctor, things like that. So I think ultimately it'll have that ability to democratize technology and access to information.
Yeah. I think we brought up the example of the resume searching earlier and how it could go through that, and it came up a couple years ago that was actually biased, right? But AI has the ability to correct that, and actually, partly could be finding those biases. The AI can be used to find those, and can correct that. And then I think that corrected system can then be used to address and make it a fair playing field for people with disabilities or other disadvantages.
And we design applications keeping, like, for example, visually impaired, right? So ADA and making sure that all of these applications that we're designing, we partner with institutions like Blind Institute of Technology, for example, and take their inputs as we architect and design our applications.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is, in many ways, some of the biggest promise of AI is helping the people who are the most in need of help. So giving mobility to people who can't walk, the elderly, can't see, can't hear. That's self-driving is great for that. What Josh was talking about with diversity in hiring in the workplace. But the important thing is that we recognize the biases that can come about as we're designing these systems. So facial recognition software is famously very, very racist. I hate to say it, but it is because what are they training on? They're training on these images of white people, right? And that's problematic. So recognizing the diversity and the biases that you are coding into the system can go a long way to correct it. And I think that when you do that, the promise is really, really powerful, because in many ways, as somebody who's looking through resumes or listening to people speak or whatever, you don't even realize your own biases, but a computer won't do that, right? If you code it in to recognize the demography of the entire country, then you can represent people who are underrepresented otherwise.
Well, I feel like the conversation could go on forever, but we can't. So, thanks to everyone thanks to all you guys, and thanks to everyone here. Thank you. Awesome. Lorenzo, back to you.
Well, we took a risk this year organizing the Elevate Ethics on a very specific topic. I think it was a worthwhile risk. I think that we should discuss more and more about the things, as we were encouraged by our panelists. I'm really pleased with the number of students that are here. I think that witness to the relevance and importance of engaging in this conversation. I invite everyone to join us for a small reception on the patio. It's a beautiful night, so I hope you can stick around and continue the conversation. Thanks so much for coming, and again, join me for another round of applause for the speakers.